How will the U.S. respond to the killing of 3 of its soldiers in Syria? Washington blames the Islamic State for the attack and vows retaliation. So, does that mean expanded military involvement? And what role would the new Syrian government play? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. It's an attack that's brought attention to the presence of hundreds of U.S. soldiers in Syria. 3 of them were killed in the assault in the central city of Palmyra. It's the first since the fall of the former President Bashar Assad a year ago, and Washington has rushed to accuse the Islamic State. The new government in Damascus has expanded its ties with the U.S. administration and also joined a coalition to fight the group and its sleeper cells. But how much of a security challenge is the Islamic State in Syria? Will the U.S. now reinforce its military presence? And if so, what risks could that pose? We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
These men are suspected of being linked to the killing of 3 US Army personnel stationed in Syria. They were arrested by Syrian security forces after the first attack on Americans in Syria since President Ahmed al-Sharaa took power. The gunman was shot dead during the attack. US President Donald Trump vowed revenge.
I can tell you in Syria, there will be a lot of damage done to the people that did it. They got the individual person, but there'll be big damage done.
The attack took place outside the town Palmyra in central Syria. Syrian officials say the perpetrator worked for national security forces, but was going to be fired from his position for holding extremist religious ideas. An investigation is underway to establish exactly who he and other suspects were affiliated with. President Trump says they were members of ISIL.
Not the Syrian government, it was ISIS. Syrian government fought by our side. The new president fought by our side.
The Pentagon says those who were injured were working on counterterrorism. The US has had troops in Syria since 2015 and says they're working with Kurdish-led forces to fight ISIL. And the US will continue with the mission to destroy the armed group. In 2015, ISIL controlled around a third of Syria, including Palmyra, where it destroyed ancient ruins. By 2019, its forces were driven out by a US-led coalition, but have since carried out attacks. The US and Syrian security forces are working together to clear Syria of groups like ISIL. President Sharaa is regarded as having a deep knowledge of its workings, having led a rebel group to overthrow former Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad. But after nearly a decade and a half of civil war, creating security and stability is proving a major challenge. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Pittsburgh is Colin Clarke, who's the Executive Director of the Soufan Center. From Cairo, Dareen Khalifa, Senior Advisor at the International Crisis Group. And from Malmö in Sweden, Orwa Ajjoub is a Syria expert, also a PhD candidate in global politics, focusing on armed groups in Syria. Thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us. And Orwa, I'll begin with you. Now, the U.S., as you know, says ISIL was behind the attack. Then you have Syria's Interior Ministry saying the attacker was a serving member of the internal security forces in Syria. So does this point to an ISIL problem or perhaps a deeper problem of extremists inside the state itself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think there is a structural issue here with the vetting process and the recruitment process of the Syrian government when it arrived to Damascus, I mean HTS in particular. So when they moved to Damascus, they tried to recruit thousands of people. In Damascus alone, for example, they recruited 12,000 before dissolving the factions in the Victory Conference. The process was very hasty. They had only in Damascus they recruited 12,000 people. It took them 2 weeks for the training, for the vetting, and it was very fast, very unstructured. And I think that was one of the issues why we have people who hold extremist views, whether are organizationally affiliated with ISIS or not. The idea here that there was no serious vetting process, and therefore you would have people, whether affiliated with ISIS or not, exist in the group. So we don't know exactly whether this person was part of the group, but we know that there was a problem with the whole process of recruitment.
Colin, Clarke, there are some who argue that ISIL as a group is still very much relevant and in fact resurgent in Syria. Do you agree with that assessment? And would you say, though, it's a different form of ISIL in 2025, or what's going on here?
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. In fact, I'm one of the people that's been saying that. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs with Caroline Rose saying exactly that in September. What's going on here is a simple matter of, in any kind of post-conflict situation, you're going to have long periods of instability. The government of Ahmed al-Shara is unable to exercise a monopoly of force over all of Syrian territory. And because of that, you're going to see what we call ungoverned space, although I would argue it's really alternatively governed, pockets of Islamic State fighters and other non-state armed groups kind of popping up. The less pressure you put on these groups, the more space they have to rearm, to rest, resurge, and to launch attacks like we've seen just this weekend.
Dareen, Khalifa, how should, or how do you as a group, at the International Crisis Group, how do you define the level of extremist threat in Syria today? I mean, is it organized ISIL cells? Is this person a lone actor, or are security institutions really compromised?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I am going to concur with what Orwa and what Colin said. I think it is quite clear that there is a vetting issue in terms of the new recruits in Syria's security forces and its military. There's also a command and control problem over the large number of forces across the country. But there is also a problem of ungoverned spaces, as Colin mentioned. The central part of Syria is in particular one that is very problematic and has been for many years under Assad. It's an area that has been used by ISIS as a rear base for many, many years. It's an area also where Assad and the Russians have invested very little infrastructure and military capabilities in. So over the years, the ISIS threat really grew very dangerous coming out of these areas. So I think it is a mix of many things. But generally speaking, this incident, tragic as it is, really showcased the complexities of this post-conflict dynamic and how fragile the security situation is in Syria. So it is something that is alarming for us. We've also written extensively about the threats of ISIS in Syria. So far, ISIS hasn't claimed this attack, but that's not unusual. Actually, we've been seeing that over the years, that many ISIS attacks haven't been claimed. So these two things, as you mentioned, Dareen, up front, that it is a member of the security force and it could be ISIS. These two things are not mutually exclusive. It seems like they're actually both occurring at the same time.
Okay, got it. So, you all seem to agree then there is a problem with the vetting process when it comes to the Syrian government, Orwa. So if there is that problem, what does the government do? How does it deal with it?
I think the issue here has to do with how Shara government approached the whole security sector from day one. I mean, this government came with a coalition of local factions. The majority of them had bad reputation of nepotism, favoritism, drug trafficking, and human rights abuse. So I think one of the options for Shara was basically to create a power that can counterbalance these factions in case he wanted to get rid of them, because as I said, they are burdened now in a way or another. So this process, the process of recruitment was basically, first to replenish the Syrian army, the new Syrian army, but also to create a new group of new groups that are mostly loyal to the new government rather than loyal to their factions. So the Syrian government also did not really thought about including other minorities, other segments of the Syrian society in the recruitment process. So, for example, all the recruits are Sunni Muslims. We don't have, some people might argue that Christian Alawites, Druze, are not interested. However, there was no attempt by the Syrian government to include them in the new security structure. So there's an issue of power sharing. There's an issue of lack of trust with others. And I think that was like the natural result of this lack of trust towards others from a Shara government.
Colin, when President Trump says that, talks about, quote, serious retaliation, what does that mean? What do you read into that?
Well, it's kind of typical Trump rhetoric. He always comes out very strong on the back end. I don't think what the president says means a different response than we would normally react to in this case. But it could very well mean increased, U.S. assistance, counterterrorism assistance to the Syrian government. Certainly, excuse me. Certainly, the United States has many different conflicts it's attempting to manage at the moment. And that's why I think Syria has kind of been put on the back burner a little bit. But we could see potential increased intelligence sharing, cooperation, security cooperation, building partner capacity. But there's also a flip side to this, because there are a lot of folks in the Trump administration that have the president's ear that want him to withdraw all U.S. troops. And if we start seeing more of these what we call green on blue attacks, which we saw in Afghanistan with the Taliban, that could very well prove the impetus for the president to withdraw troops altogether. And I think that would actually be quite disastrous in the long run.
Here's the thing, Colin, though, just one more for you before I bring in Dareen from Cairo. Some analysts are saying that, look, there are gaps in the U.S. policy when it comes to Syria. For example, you have no Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs. You have a vacant national security roles, as you're very well aware. So do you think Washington is able to manage a complex transition like Syria under its own conditions?
We'll see. I'm skeptical myself. And for an administration that's talked so much about the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan under the Biden administration, you better hope that if a similar withdrawal takes place in Syria, that they get it right. But again, there's multiple parties that have a vote here. And I think that even if the U.S. were to withdraw, you'd see the Islamic State going all out, trying to attack U.S. forces on the way out to give that image that, look, it's us that drove the U.S. out. It's this very kind of powerful, ubiquitous actor. And I do think the Islamic State is surging. And if the U.S. does go through with that withdrawal or even managed drawdown, we're going to see the Islamic State getting exactly what they want, which is more room to maneuver. And they'll likely try to accelerate that.
I'm going to come back to you on that point you just made about the Islamic State is surging and ask you to elaborate on that a little bit more. But first, let me bring in Dareen Khalifa on this U.S., on the point that the U.S. Is making, what President Trump had to say. Dareen, does this attack, do you think, strengthen argument for a U.S. withdrawal, as Colin was alluding to, or will people in Washington be pushing for a stronger foothold in Syria, a more entrenched occupation, as some people call it?
Well, first of all, let me push back a bit on the argument that the U.S. has had an incoherent policy in Syria. I would say I followed Syria for over a decade, and I can argue that this is the most consistent and clear of U.S. foreign policies when it came to Syria that I've seen in the last decade. They're very, very clear in what they're doing and in articulating it.
Tell us what you're basing that on, though.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm basing this on, but let me just finish the sentence in the sense that the U.S. envoy to Syria was very quick right after the incident to put out a long statement basically rebutting or refuting the notion that this is going to lead to any major changes in policy. He basically said that and explained why. He said we're going to continue to advance this by with and through policy in fighting ISIS because this is important and of national strategic importance and significance to us. And it guarantees a light U.S. footprint, and it guarantees also light casualties. And he's not wrong. This is the first incident in the aftermath of the fall of Assad. Generally speaking, since 2015, since the war against ISIS in Syria, the U.S. had very few casualties in Syria. So yes, while the ultimate goal is to pull out troops. We know that has always been President Trump's instinct since his first administration. He hasn't been quick to implement that at all. He's had, or at least people working on the file has been able to convince him to maintain this consistent rhetoric when it came to Syria, at least, which is that in order for them to be able to leave the country, there needs to be a number of things in place. First, including an agreement between their Kurdish partners who've been fighting ISIS since 2015 and the central government in Damascus that could guarantee that areas under their control are merged in the central state in a peaceful way, and that simultaneously they would be gradually increasing support and cooperation with Damascus. They've nudged Damascus to join the international coalition to fight ISIS, which they did. And since then, they've been sharing intel, and there's been increased cooperation and increased access to resources from Damascus. So in that sense, the US is clear on what the ultimate goal is. They're not rushing to implement it, and they're trying to push and forge agreements to basically make that happen. So, and that's why I said this is the most consistent of US Syria policies I've seen in the last decade. It might not be a policy that a lot agree with, but it is at least clear and consistent, and all parties in Syria understand what the US is doing and why they're doing it.
Okay, just back to what I asked, though, Dareen, in the beginning, whether this attack strengthens arguments for a U.S. withdrawal, or will it increase the U.S.'s footprints a little bit more in Syria? What do you think?
I think in terms of troop presence, the U.S. president has always been the leading voice on this. And again, as I mentioned, President Trump put out a statement that did not at all talk about troop withdrawal, and he didn't at all also point responsibility to Damascus. On the contrary, he said that the Syrian president is outraged by this and that they're going to continue to work with the Syrians to retaliate to the fighting. So there was no mention of troop withdrawal. Again, it will be a fool's errand to try to predict what President Trump is going to say or do down the line, but so far it hasn't necessarily strengthened that instinct in him. So I think despite the tragedy of this event, I don't think so far it has stirred a massive change in policy in Washington.
Okay, Orwa, Dareen was mentioning the issue of the Kurds. So let's look at that for just a moment. As we know, the U.S. relied heavily on Kurdish-led forces in that fight against ISIL. So today, do you think sidelining the Kurds risks weakening one of perhaps, as some people describe, the most effective counter-extremism partners for the U.S.?
Yeah, I think this is a big question because on the one hand, the SDF has been a reliable partner for the US-led international coalition to fight ISIS. It's a reliable partner on the ground. But I would argue HTS has also been a reliable partner for the US in fighting high-value targets of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I've argued this since 2020 when the group was denying it all the time because it doesn't want to create tension with its support base for cooperating with the US against the ISIS and Al-Qaeda from which the group emerged. So I think even like the U.S. intelligence community has talked about this. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Turkey said that HTS has been cooperating for a long time now. So yes, SDF has been a reliable partner, but also HTS has did a lot of work. We have statistics about dozens of operations that the group has carried out during its time in Idlib, and also when it moved to Damascus. So yes, on the one hand, supporting SDF always has been beneficial for the war against ISIS, but also the Syrian government now in power has been doing a great job when it comes to this particular file.
So, Orwa, would integrating Kurdish forces into Syrian state institutions then stabilize the country, do you think? Or could we witness new tensions and fragmentations that then extremist groups could exploit?
I think definitely at some point there should be some sort of integration, especially that the international environment pretty much arguing or pushing towards unification of Syria with no federation or like so there is no appetite for such an issue. The question becomes, how would you convince the SDF to integrate, of course not the SDF and many factions from the Ministry of Defense to integrate together, though they have been fighting each other for a long time. So, for example, SNA faction, Syrian National Army, which is now the big chunk of the Ministry of Defense, has been fighting the SDF. Of course, like being Turkey proxy in a way or another, they have been fighting SDF for a long time. So the question, how would you able to convince both actors, SDF and Syrian national factions, to work together against ISIS and forget about all the past grievances? So, for example, Syrian National Army committed a human rights abuse in Afrin, right, against the Kurds. Now, the question becomes how you convince the Kurds that it's okay, we're going to leave this behind and we're going to find a solution to work our differences together. I think that's a big question here. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, centralized government, if the SDF works together with the Syrian government, sharing intelligence, sharing capabilities, they would be much more effective in fighting the group.
Okay, Colin, back to you. A short while ago, you were saying that the Islamic State is surging as a group in Syria. I wonder if you can just elaborate on that, give us perhaps some evidence to support that claim, and also look at the other groups in Syria. It's not only ISIL, obviously, that's present on the ground. What other groups are present on the ground, and how strong do they remain today?
Yeah, so for evidence, you just need to look at U.S. Central Command data, which shows increases and an uptick over the past several years. So we're seeing this is a group that's strengthening its attempts to recruit. At the Soufan Center, we closely track ISIS propaganda, and we're seeing a resurgence of ISIS propaganda, not only in Syria, but globally. This is a group that's also now leveraging artificial intelligence to translate its propaganda to multiple languages. But in Syria proper, you've got, remnants of, as you would in any kind of country that's experienced civil war for as long as Syria did, various factions, remnants of Al-Qaeda linked groups. You'll see the occasional U.S. strike targeting various extremists. So it remains a hornet's nest of violent extremists and jihadist activity. The Islamic State is the most well known, and I think the most capable, and it's the group that we need to be most concerned about. But you have the potential for splinter groups, for front groups, that break off. Including from the Syrian security forces. I mean, we put out a paper in May looking at the various kind of factions, what we call tactical groups, with groups of individuals from the Balkans, from Central Asia, from the Caucasus. And there are extremists among those factions that may not want to go down the path of this governing project of al-Shara, and they may seek to do other things, including link up with ISIS. ISIS is deliberately trying to recruit these individuals who are also among the most battle-tested and experienced out of all the kind of violent armed state actors in Syria.
Dareen, you were nodding along to what Colin had to say, if you'd like to add on to any of that. And also, if the new Syrian government fails to fully reform and control its own security forces and sector, what do you think is at stake for the country?
Well, a lot is at stake, not just for the country, but for the entire region. And I don't want to go down that doom and gloom scenario, but we've lived it before in 2013, 2014, up until 2015, when the global coalition interfered to fight ISIS. But at the time, the rapid expansion of jihadist control over Syria and Iraq, and because of the porous border between the two countries, and obviously, likewise, the impact on Lebanon and the spillover in Turkey, and it really was disastrous. We ended up with ISIS controlling territory, really like 5 times the size of Lebanon, and that lasted for a few years, and we're still suffering from the impact of that up until now. And I think that will take a few more years to actually contain effectively. So a lot is at stake, and I think everyone's rooting for the success of the government, but we also have to understand that it's also just been a year. Damascus has been trying to forge all these alliances with groups that they've been fighting with in the past. They're doing so with very limited resources, with massive web of sanctions that's been imposed on them up until very recently. Some are still lingering. So they're trying to do a lot with the very little they have. Obviously, we've talked about the Kurdish forces, which I think the integration of which within the central state is going to be an enormous boost for the security infrastructure. To your earlier question, they are a massively effective fighting force. They have years of experience fighting ISIS. They're very disciplined. And I think if and when they are added to Damascus's fighting capacity, I think that will give a massive boost. It will also give a lot of confidence to Syria's minorities, who, as Orwa pointed out, are yet to be included in the security apparatus. So again, a lot is at stake. A lot has already been done by Damascus, but I think the shortcomings that we've mentioned up top are evident, and I think they were expected in such a fragile transition after 15 years of civil war. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, Orwa, looking ahead, do you think countries like the U.S. as well as the international community will now be rethinking what qualifies as perhaps a trusted security partner in Syria after this incident?
Yes, I genuinely think that. I mean, it's of course it's a tragic incident, right? But it's a tragic not only because it's a 3 human souls, but also because it's Americans, right? That's the case in Syria. So that's why everyone is talking about it. But I think that for European capitals and also for Trump, they know this is not the end of the world. It happens in a war context, and they have talked to Sharia, and also I think the most important assessment in this situation comes from the security from the intelligence community. And I think the intelligence community has been very clear, especially European and Western, they have been very clear that Sharia could be worked with. They've tried him in Idlib, and they have been trying him in Damascus, and he has been doing whatever he can to become a reliable security partner. And also it's important for him at any time is basically to tell the international community that he could be trusted to lead on the operation, not through the SDF. But I mean, if the last thing, if you allow me to say, is that
Sure.
The question of whether the SDF will integrate with the Syrian government is pretty much a political one. The question is to what extent Sharia is willing to share power really with other minorities. So it's not about military, or it's about the feeling of minorities that they will be included in the new government, meaningful inclusion. And this is where we can talk about the ability to see unified Syrian army that includes the Kurds, Alawites, Druze, and other minorities.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to put that to Colin as the final word from you when it comes to this issue of the SDF that Orwa and Dareen have been outlining. Where do things go to next, and how is that going to work? Is the Syrian government under Sharia willing to work with the Kurdish forces and vice versa?
Well, the real answer is we won't know until we see it, but we made it through this entire segment without mentioning Al-Hol and some of the other prison and detention camps, which I've seen as a glaring vulnerability. And I think the Islamic State has long had its eye on these camps. We've seen a Breaking the Walls campaign in the past. I won't elaborate on this because I know we're close to time, but these are essential to figure out what to do with these with these camps, how to manage them, and we can't do that without the SDF and the Kurds.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Colin, Clarke, Dareen, Khalifa, and Orwa Ajjoub. Thanks for joining us. Well, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X as well. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.